Morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Lookout. Today's 8/26, 22, 26th of August. Coming to the end of Dirty August. Dirty August is a hotshot term, and it's wrapping up. So what that means for these fires that we're covering is just that as we move into September, we move into a season where we've got kind of a change from our kind of normal summertime pattern, and September is often breezier and windier. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, the seasonal transition means for the fire that we're watching here. Both fires, actually. We're going to look at the Campbell fire by Willow Creek, and we're going to look at the Rum Creek fire. We're going to talk a little bit about the Red Salmon Complex from 2020, and going to look at what's going on now with the spread on Campbell. So we'll start off like we usually do here, looking over Willow Creek out to the east. Still, things are really cooled off on the Willow Creek side. Everything that's been burning here for, almost 2 weeks. So the big news here is just that where the fire has crossed Cedar Creek and running up towards the wilderness, it's been really active. More active in the last couple of days than we've seen. Besides the big run that we had about a week ago. But the red here is yesterday's growth back to this white line. So we got really steady spread up canyon. We had a spot here yesterday that's kind of grown up and moved out. And fire's backing down into Cedar Creek also. The fire lines that I've got here are several days old. But the box, still it's pretty much still the big box with the dozer line. Interesting thing that's happening right now is, one, they're firing their way along this ridge. I think it's Lone Pine Ridge. Taking it slow. There's hand line here, kind of on a steep slope, and then there's prepped roads and dozer line coming down along this ridge. Yesterday we talked about how the Red Salmon Complex here kind of might provide kind of a catcher's mitt. Having not seen that on the ground, I was kind of just waving my arms around. I don't know what that burned like. There's also the 2018 signboard fire over here. Both of those burned late in the season. Red Salmon looks like it really kind of just slowly made its way into here late. They were firing this out in late September. So I don't really know the condition out here, and I don't have any idea. When I said scars stop, other fire scars, just been thinking about that. I haven't been out on the ground here. I don't know what this looks like. I can, and yesterday I was, when I'm speaking in these kind of idealized like terms, big picture terms, I understand why there's an urgency to button this up, because we're looking east here, and we've got a history in Northern California of big east wind events in September. So they don't want this hanging out any longer than possible, because you could have an east wind that would carry it down here towards Hoopa, or they could then turn around and blast it out into this area to the west that hasn't had fire for a long time. So I understand why there's a sense of urgency to button this up, and we'll see how it goes. I think one of the things that's interesting over here, as far as kind of what's going to happen in the next week, is just that as this fire's backing down into Cedar Creek here, there's potential now for it to run up to this ridge here that's between the fire and Trinity Village. This area here below this blue line is all stuff that was fired a couple weeks ago. The mid-slope road on the east end of the fire that got fired and kind of carefully brought down this ridge. So now we've got potential for this fire to push up and get established here above Trinity Village in this bowl. And not a lot of great options in here for slowing this edge of the fire as it backs down into here. So a lot of growth yesterday on this spot. Fire's just kind of slowly filling in. We talked about how these other fires may help slow it down. And there's been some comments on a Facebook thread about this, just about like how long do previous fires hold up a new fire. This fire here is 7 years old, and there seems to be kind of some agreement that, 7 years is kind of, you're starting to get into a time period where the fire scar may or may not buy you a lot. It might burn hot in this brush, but oftentimes in this younger brush, there's not enough kind of dead material. Also depends on how many times the area has burned before, but we've got a lot of these brush fields up in here from previous fires. Someone pointed out yesterday that we've had a lot of fires up here in Denny and kind of the river complex, and that we've really got no track record of stopping these fires. I can think of one exception. It's the Backbone fire. But I was talking to a friend who's been an ops chief on a bunch of these fires, and he said the Backbone is like one of the only fires where he can think of in this country where firefighting actually kind of wrapped it. It's out here, 2009, kind of reddish. Otherwise, yeah, these fires burn until it rains. So, be interesting to see with the next couple of days how the firing goes here on this ridge, and whether or not the firing, whether or not they make enough progress on the firing here to get out ahead of it. The fire's back down to the bottom of the drainage here, and so next couple of days are kind of key to see whether or not they can get enough depth on their firing here before this comes up out of there and spots over to the other side. We've talked quite a bit about kind of timing on these campaign fires, and how you have to be kind of predicting how far out ahead of the fire you need to be working, how long it's going to take you to get your firing operation prepped, fired, and held before your fire pushes you. And you can't take these things too quickly either. And if you do a big firing operation before you've been able to snag and prep, then the odds are high that when you're moving your operation along, and depending on how many resources you have to patrol behind you, if you don't have time to prep and snag, a snag can catch on fire, fall over your line. And so one friend of mine who's just has been saying, like, unless you've got time to prep, fire, hold, and mop up, there's a lot of things working against the timing of your firing operation. So we'll see how this unfolds. Not a lot of action that I can tell of on the Amen fire. Just a bunch of squiggly lines, and it always amazes me how much mapping gets done. All these different lines. Someone had to draw those. Anyway, it's a mess visually, but a lot of information there. One thing I think is kind of interesting about the bigger picture here is we've got Trinity Alps Wilderness in green here. It's a huge wilderness area, and you can see kind of the fire scars over the top of it. But basically, this Doge line is kind of as close as they can push to the edge of the wilderness and before the fire's out there in the wilderness. Wilderness just means that some places wilderness means you can't use bulldozers, and it also means just there's no roads. It's wildland. So, got a lot of wildland in Northern California. Up here we got the Marble Mountain Wilderness. Here we got the Trinity Alps Wilderness. So with that in mind, we're going to fly now up to Oregon and check in on Rum Creek. We also got Siskiyou Wilderness here. And I don't have Wilderness Lair hooked up right now for Oregon, but you got the Kalmiopsis Wilderness out here. There's some other ones. So let's see. Come down here. One thing we were talking about the other day is how they're fighting this fire to kind of protect these, in part because BLM's got clear cuts out here, and as far as I can tell, clear cuts aren't an endangered species in Oregon. I got a lot of them. One thing interesting with BLM in Oregon is that we talk about checkerboard in California, and there's also a railroad that went up through the center of Oregon, and so there's this checkerboard ownership on either side of kind of the I-5 corridor, and BLM manages that, and part of their charter there is they have to log it to provide money for schools. So it's one of those cases where land management kind of gets held hostage to political concerns, where it's hard to say you don't want the BLM to clear cut and log when your opponents can say like, oh, well, don't you want the schools to have money? And so it seems like it's a little cynical to me. And just that, public land in Oregon being managed for even age management. We got plenty of private companies that are managing for timber in Oregon, and you could definitely go down a rabbit hole on BLM in Oregon and their land policy, but no one in kind of political power in Oregon wants to manage this fire. Anyway, the fire it's cooled off on the kind of west flank. We talked about the massive air tanker show that's kind of painted down through here, and there's kind of moderate spread flanking down through here, but they're showing this whole kind of side as just being kind of scattered heat and cooling off. Fire's more active on the uphill side, or up canyon side, actively kind of spotting and doing its thing. Don't have a lot of other information on this fire, but when your fire's kind of the only game in town, which right now there's just not a lot going on out here in the west, you get a lot of aerial resources, and that helicopter drops and air tanker drops have definitely kept this edge cool. So they're not saying they've got much containment out there. Anyway, that's Rum Creek. Wanted to jump real quick to some imagery of the Red Salmon Complex, just because we're talking about Dirty August today. And just take me a minute to find where it was. Okay, so here's Red Salmon Complex last year on 1st of September. And what I was interested in was trying to figure out when did we have big spread days on this fire. Here's by the 24th. So they're not necessarily in sequence. Here's the 21st, 14th. So they have a nice table down in here that gives you the growth by day, which is pretty cool. So you can see that the fire. All right. Fire had some big runs. Like it burned like 10,000 acres on the 7th of September. And on the 8th, it burned 13,000 acres. And it burned 5,000. So, you can see earlier in the incident, like there was days that it grew 600 or it grew 300 or 800 but we've definitely seen some huge runs recently in the fall with the fall winds on fires that, you get used to thinking that they're just kind of skunking around, and then they can really explode out of there. So here's the early in September on the 14th. We've been talking about the ridge here that comes down that could be a catcher's mitt for the fire we're on. I think it's Tishatang Ridge. And you can see that they were firing the backside of that ridge on the 14th of September. And by 24th, they were firing kind of the front side of it, like it had slopped over. And that it wasn't even really close to there 2 weeks earlier. 21st, they still hadn't gotten a lot of depth on that ridge. So there was another fire that happened later in the season called the Signboard. I'm just kind of curious as we're talking about like whether or not this burn here that's now kind of filled in will buy an advantage if the current firing operations are happening on this ridge here. So it brings up just this point that when you see a polygon on a map, it doesn't tell you anything about the severity of the fire. It doesn't tell you if it just backed through there. It doesn't even tell you if it burned, really. Like if they tried to burn this out and lit it from the bottom and kind of it was cold along the edge, it's going to show as being part of the fire, whether or not there's an interior island or not sometimes. So goes to show, just you can't say like, oh, just because this area is all, solid color on the map, that there's anything kind of continuous or predictable about the actual fire effects. All right, so that's enough. I'm gonna jump out and take some questions here. JD says 28,000 acres, 80%, no change from yesterday. Yeah, the infrared shows quite a bit of growth. At Papoose Lake during the storm started it nonstop thunder for 2 hours. You talking about red salmon, JD? All right. David K says, wish they'd leave those dozer lines open all the time and fire the backburns from ridges proactively on our terms, fall or spring, pending fuel conditions. Stuck in reactive versus proactive. I agree. And so many people I talk to, operations chiefs and, the people that kind of figure out these big firing operations, say the same thing. Let's fire all of our south-facing ridges in the late fall and just let the fires back down. Let's go big. Totally agree. We're talking on the Yeti fire about, they're having to fire in beginning of August, they're having to fire this ridge, and like nobody wants to do a big firing operation, when it's 102 degrees out. And best time to fire that firing operation is like after the second rain in November, right? Or in February of a dry year. Like we're forced to put fire on the ground during the worst possible time of year. And we do have to get to a point where, we come out here with this dozer line that's here, and now it's like, well, even if the fire didn't get to that, it'd be good practice to come back here in, late fall and burn it out. Put fire on the ground and let it back down until it rains. There's elements of risk in that for sure. You could do that and then get, 2 months of dry winter and east winds and burn up Hoopa. I was talking to Will Harling in Mid-Klamath Watershed about that recently, and it's like, well, that wouldn't be an issue if we came in here and burned all around this community. And there's actually a lot of burning that gets done on Hoopa. The Yurok people have never really lost their use of cultural fire. I talked to a guy who's from Hoopa, and he said, well, you might call it arson. We call it cultural fire and land management. I was up there 15 years ago maybe, and BIA was like, oh my, Hoopa has the highest arson rate of anywhere in like BIA jurisdiction. And it's like, no man, that's cultural burning. That's not arson. People start hundreds or thousands of fires in Hoopa and they don't become large because they know what they're doing. Their families have been burning there for thousands of years. So one man's arson's another man's cultural burning. But the more cultural fire we have, the more we empower people to burn around their neighborhoods. If we're having to adopt tactics that don't make much sense because we're worried about burning up a town, it's like, well, let's spend some of this, $2 billion budget on protecting the town, and then we can have a lot more options in the backcountry. Someone's saying, Nipa, Sequa, carb, shaking my head. No kidding, man. No kidding. Nipa needs to go away. Sorry. Nipa needs to go away. It's broken. Forest Service can't get anything done. Sequa too. There's got to be a balance. People are afraid that if we take away Nipa, we're just going to clear cut everything. It doesn't have to be black and white like that. Someone says, any prognostication on fire season in total so far? Seems like a mild one. Does that have any implications for the rest of the season? No idea. Ask me in November. In the fall, winds can change everything in a day. Yep. And that puts us in this kind of fear-based decision making. When we have to make tactical decisions on a fire like this, you got to think like, well, what happens if I get a Slater fire style east wind? Am I gonna, push a fire all the way to the coast? It's, when you look at Slater, up here to the north, this blue shape here, the only thing that kept this fire from burning out all the way to Crescent City was that we had a recent burn just inland of it. The purple here is a wilderness area, but we had this Natchez fire Slater had strong east winds and super dry humidity for an entire day, and it blew it flanked along this, and then when it got past it could run out. But that's in everyone's memory now. Like no one wants to be the person to let this fire burn an inch more than they had to, and then had this escape terrible fire that fire of the century. So when I'm talking yesterday about how firefighting's dumb, it's not to discount how hard it is for people to make these decisions in this current landscape that we have to work with. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Gotta bail out.